Fear is an ancient force. It's not just an instinctive response to real dangers, but also a reflection of the uncharted territories of the psyche. For Carl Jung, fear is a direct manifestation of what we've relegated to the shadow, the hidden side of our mind where we store what we consider unacceptable or threatening. But why can we never fully master our fears? Perhaps the answer lies in the very nature of mastery. Mastery implies control, yet fear, by its very essence, eludes us. It is rooted in the collective unconscious, a vast network of memories and archetypes we share as a species. That's why we often experience fears we can't explain. The dark, heights, crowds, these archetypal fears aren't merely individual. They echo a distant past where our ancestors faced tangible dangers in such scenarios. The problem arises when we try to suppress or eliminate these fears, ignoring their purpose. Jung warns that the unconscious doesn't vanish under repression. It resurfaces, often in more unsettling ways. Fears are not enemies to be defeated, but teachers to be understood. In trying to conquer them, we create an internal battle that consumes us. Instead, Jung suggests we integrate them. This means recognizing what fear is trying to tell us. Often, it points to parts of ourselves we'd rather not confront. The fear of failure, for instance, might hide an internal demand for perfection, a deeply rooted belief that we can only be loved if we're flawless. Facing this requires courage, not to defeat fear, but to accept what it reveals about us. Archetypes are universal structures of the psyche that Jung identified as recurring patterns of behavior and thought. When we confront fear, we often activate the hero archetype, the one who must overcome challenges to grow. But we're not always ready to take on the hero's role. At times, we embody the victim archetype, trapped in the narrative that fear is stronger than we are. This cycle of vulnerability isn't weakness, it's a necessary stage in self-discovery. Modern society, however, frequently pressures us to skip these stages, to display strength at all times. Fear is stigmatized, seen as a sign of weakness or incompetence. This judgment distances us from a deeper understanding. Jung argues that the journey toward individuation, the process of becoming who we truly are, requires us to face our shadows and, by extension, our fears. There are no shortcuts. Dreams, for example, often connect us with the shadowy aspects of our fears. A nightmare may seem terrifying, but Jung believed these dreams were invitations to explore the unknown within us. A monster in a dream isn't just something to be defeated. It represents something neglected, something demanding attention. If we want to understand why we never master our fears, we must first consider that this mastery may not be the right goal. Instead, integrating fear, living with it in harmony, recognizing it as an essential part of the human experience, is the true challenge. For Jung, the greatest obstacles in our journey aren't external monsters, but internal ones. Fear, when properly understood, can become a bridge to transformation. It forces us to examine the cracks in our convictions, the desires we avoid, and the truths we'd rather ignore. Yet resistance to this process is almost inevitable. The human mind, programmed to seek comfort, fights against the discomfort that fear brings. But it is precisely in this friction that the potential for growth lies. Take, for example, the fear of loneliness, a struggle many face in silence. At first glance, this fear seems tied to the human need for connection. However, through Jung's lens, it reveals something deeper, an internal disconnection, a refusal to accept the company of our own shadows. We flee from loneliness because we fear confronting who we truly are without distractions or masks. In this sense, fear isn't the problem, but a symptom of a greater fragmentation. Jung believed that we navigate these dilemmas through the process of individuation. This requires acknowledging that we are not just rational beings, but also emotional and symbolic. Symbols, especially those emerging in dreams or irrational fears, are the unconscious mind's way of communicating something essential. A seemingly trivial fear, like speaking in public, may reflect a deeper archetype, the exile who fears rejection by the tribe. When we understand this, we can begin to transform fear into an ally rather than an enemy. One reason we never fully master our fears is that we fail to grasp the delicate balance between light and shadow. Jung argued that humans are not solely composed of goodness, clarity, and rationality. There is a darker, chaotic, and irrational side within all of us, the shadow. Many of our fears arise from this internal divide. We try to ignore the shadow, pretending it doesn't exist, but the more we avoid it, the more it grows. Consider the fear of failure. It's not merely about losing something tangible, but also about an unconscious narrative we've constructed about ourselves. Perhaps our shadow holds traces of insecurity or feelings of inadequacy that we've denied our entire lives. Confronting this fear doesn't mean eliminating it, but accepting that these aspects are part of who we are. Jung said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." This leads to an essential question. What does it mean to master fear? Does mastery really mean eliminating it? Or is this relentless pursuit of control an illusion created by the ego? In Jungian thought, the ego is only one part of the psyche. It strives for stability, but the unconscious, vast and powerful, operates by its own rules. Fear reminds us that the ego is not absolute, that greater forces are at play. Facing our fears requires humility. It's not about winning a battle, but opening ourselves to the complexity of the human experience. When we stop resisting fear, we begin to understand its true role. It is a guide, a signal that we are about to enter psychic territories that have the power to transform us. The pursuit of mastering fear is deeply tied to the illusion of control. As a society, we are constantly encouraged to believe that we can and must control everything, our future, our emotions, and even how we relate to the unknown. Yet Jung warns that this need for control is, in truth, an attempt by the ego to shield itself from vulnerability. The ego, fragile and limited, feels threatened by the vast ocean of the unconscious where fear resides. Fear is, at its core, the materialization of the unknown. When we confront it, we see not only what terrifies us, but also what lies beyond our understanding. This unknown is inevitable. It permeates every decision, every relationship, and every moment of life. The attempt to dominate it is often a futile effort to resist the very nature of existence, which is uncertain and impermanent. Jung viewed the confrontation with the unknown as a dance, not a battle. He believed that the human psyche is designed to evolve through this interaction. Instead of fighting fear or trying to control it, he suggested we learn to live alongside it, listening to what it has to teach us. This coexistence is not passive. It demands courage, patience, and above all, the willingness to abandon the illusion that we are absolute masters of our destiny. We do not face our fears in isolation. We exist within a collective web where individual fears intertwine with those of groups, cultures, and even entire civilizations. Jung introduced the concept of the collective unconscious to explain how these forces transcend the individual. For instance, the fear of the future is a widely shared sentiment during times of crisis, wars, pandemics, or climate change. These collective fears often manifest as diffuse anxiety, a persistent sense that something terrible is looming. The problem with collective fears is that, when unacknowledged, they feed the shadow of society. Groups begin projecting their fears onto others, be it minorities, governments, or unseen forces. This projection creates a cycle of fear and hostility, perpetuating conflicts and hindering the search for real solutions. Jung argued that just as individuals must integrate their shadows, societies too must confront the truths they prefer to ignore. For example, modern society's obsession with progress and technological control often masks a deep fear of chaos. In our quest for quick fixes and absolute control, We sacrifice balance, ignoring the psychological and environmental consequences of our actions. This imbalance reflects the collective repression of the shadow, a refusal to acknowledge that chaos and uncertainty are intrinsic to life. But there is hope. Just as individuals can find wisdom by integrating their fears, societies too can grow by confronting their shadows. This requires leaders, thinkers, and citizens willing to face the darkest aspects of our humanity, our weaknesses, selfishness, and destructive impulses, with honesty and compassion. Carl Jung said that the true confrontation with fear is an act of courage, though not in the common heroic sense. Courage, for Jung, is the willingness to step into the unknown, fully aware that absolute control will never be ours. It involves accepting fear as an intrinsic part of the human experience rather than treating it as an enemy. This is an act of surrender, not passive resignation, but an active openness to learning and transformation. Facing fear begins with a simple yet profound gesture: self-observation. What scares us? Why? When we observe fear without judgment, it ceases to be a chaotic force and becomes a coded message from the unconscious. Often, what we fear has less to do with what is out there and more with what is in here. For instance, the fear of rejection might reveal a deep longing for belonging. The fear of failure might reflect our struggle to break free from external expectations. Jung argued that this self-exploration is essential to the process of individuation. By investigating our fears, we uncover layers of ourselves that were previously hidden. It is in the space between fear and understanding that we find our potential for transformation. When we confront fear, we do not eliminate it, we redefine it. It ceases to be a barrier and becomes a gateway. Transforming fear does not mean eradicating it, but allowing it to transform us. This transformation occurs in cycles. First, we resist fear, attempting to suppress or rationalize it. Then, when resistance becomes unsustainable, we are forced to face it. This confrontation challenges us to let go of old beliefs, behaviors, and identities that no longer serve us. Finally, if we allow ourselves to move through this crisis, we emerge more whole and self-aware. A classic example of this process is the dark night of the soul, a concept explored by Jung and echoed in many spiritual traditions. This state is marked by profound fear, confusion, and disconnection. It feels as though everything we knew has disintegrated. Yet Jung saw the dark night of the soul as a prelude to rebirth. Just as the hero in myths and fairy tales must face dragons to claim the treasure, we too must confront our deepest fears to access our inner riches. Jung believed that fear forces us to relinquish our attachment to the ego and make space for something greater, the self, the totality of our being. This process is painful because it demands that we let go of parts of ourselves we once thought essential. Yet it is in this shedding that we find freedom. Fear shows us what we are not so that we can discover who we truly are. The idea of mastering fear assumes it is an enemy to be defeated. But what if, instead, we embraced fear as an inevitable companion? Jung suggested that by doing so, we free ourselves from the need to fight it. We recognize that fear is not an obstacle, but a guide, a signal that we are standing at the edge of the known, ready to explore new dimensions of ourselves and the world. Accepting fear does not mean yielding to it. It means no longer running away. It's a willingness to face it honestly, even if that means confronting our vulnerabilities. When we do this, we find that fear loses some of its power. It doesn't vanish, but it stops controlling us. We become freer to act authentically, even in the face of the unknown. This acceptance is, ultimately, a form of love, a love for ourselves and for our journey, with all its imperfections and uncertainties. As Jung famously said, "What you resist persists, what you accept transforms." In many mythologies and timeless stories, fear marks the first step of the hero's journey, as described by Joseph Campbell, whose work was profoundly influenced by Jung's ideas. The hero is called to leave the familiar world and venture into the unknown, often symbolized by monsters, darkness, or chaotic forces. It is at this moment that fear intensifies, representing the natural resistance to change and transformation. However, the hero who tries to avoid or control fear never completes their journey. Only by facing what they fear, and often failing in the process, do they uncover the inner resources needed to move forward. The implicit message in many of these narratives is that fear is not a roadblock on the hero's path, it is the path. Confronting it is not a choice, but a necessity for growth. In our own lives, we are the protagonists of this archetypal journey. Each fear we face is a step toward individuation, the process of becoming whole. Yet our culture often forgets that failure and fear are essential parts of this process. There is an obsession with results, with quickly overcoming challenges and projecting an image of invulnerability. This approach often alienates us from our humanity and our connection to the self. Jung reminds us that true courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to face it with vulnerability. The true hero is not the one who eliminates fear, but the one who learns to coexist with it. They understand that fear is a reminder that we are alive, moving toward the unknown, where real growth happens. One of the reasons we never truly conquer our fears is because we try to avoid them at all costs. We live in a society that values comfort, predictability, and control. Discomfort is seen as something to be eliminated, and fear as a flaw to be corrected. But this approach denies the transformative essence of fear. Discomfort is the fertile ground for psychic evolution. When we avoid fear, we also avoid the opportunities for growth it offers. It is in confronting discomfort that we learn the most about ourselves. Jung reminds us that the unconscious is not an enemy, but a part of us seeking expression. Ignoring it is to ignore our own complexity and depth. Take, for example, the fear of change, a universal experience. Changes, especially those we don't choose, force us to let go of the familiar. They challenge our identities, relationships, and beliefs. Yet, instead of trying to master or control these changes, we can learn to accept them as a natural part of life. The fear of change is, at its core, the fear of growth. When we stop resisting fear and start listening to it, it transforms into wisdom. It teaches us about our limits, desires, and priorities. It shows us where we are stuck and where we need to break free. Above all, it connects us to our shared humanity. Everyone feels fear. It's part of what it means to be alive. By embracing fear as part of our journey, we begin to see that it does not define us. It guides us. It is a constant reminder that we are in process, always evolving, always learning. For Jung, this learning brings us closer to wholeness, to the self that encompasses both light and shadow. The real question, then, isn't why can't we conquer our fears, but rather, how can we learn to walk with them, to listen to them, to grow from them? It is in this willingness to face the unknown that we find not only courage, but also wisdom and freedom. Facing our fears is an ongoing challenge, but it is also an opportunity for growth and transformation. If this video helped you reflect on your relationship with fear, don't forget to give it a like and share your thoughts in the comments. We love hearing from you. Subscribe to the channel for more content exploring the human mind and check out the recommended videos on the end screen to continue your journey of self-discovery. Thank you for watching and see you next time.